Hello and welcome to today's episode of Bright Spots at ABCD. As people are trickling in, why don't you go ahead and in the chat, we'll give people a minute to come in, but in the chat, maybe you could, you'll see a prompt there. Would love to have you tell us a little bit about where you're coming in from, and if you could be a neighbor in any fictional TV show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Friends, whatever, but a TV show, a movie, or anything else, what would you choose? So drop that in the chat, where you're coming in from, a little bit about what neighbor you'd be from any fictional show or story, and we'll give people a minute to get in and get settled. Okay, and Jay's joining us from Holland, Michigan. And we're giving people a minute to come in. If you're just joining us, why don't you share us a little bit about where you're coming in from today? If you have an organization you're representing, who is that? And you're kind of fictional characters, you'd be a fictional neighbor. You'd be in any show or anything, movie, book. And Grand Rapids, welcome. Andy, how are you? Great. If you're just joining us, welcome, welcome, welcome. Oh my goodness, welcome Janine, all the way from South Africa joining us. Yo, yes. Well, as you drop that in, we'll go ahead and get started because we want to spend some time. Oh, Karen, welcome, Karen. We definitely want to optimize our time with Dr. Thurber this morning. But again, just to say a warm welcome to everybody to today's episode of Bright Spots in ABCD. This is a service we offer where we invite what we think of as thought leaders or practitioners who are doing outstanding work, excellent work, and showing us the way to operate from an asset-based, relationally oriented, and a place-driven approach to creating transformation in our neighborhoods, in our communities, our cities. And so we have the pleasure of having with us today Dr. Thurber, author of the Neighborhood Story Project. And so we're going to start with that, but just again, just a couple of details as we get started. Again, the approach is I'll be your moderator today, and we'll have about 20 minutes where I'll spend some time with Dr. Thurber just to get the conversation started. But then you'll have an opportunity to also get your questions answered. I would love it if you would use the Q&A function. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon with a question mark. That's the Q&A function. And so then I would invite you to use that Q&A function as a way to drop your questions in, just to make sure it's clean, so we know there's a question for our guest speaker today. That leaves the chat open for conversation and dialogue, and your question won't get lost in there. Secondly, we won't spend as much time on ABCD theory, but just so you know, when I talk about ABCD, I mean asset-based community development. And that's our focused methodology or process that we use. That's again asset-based, relationally driven, and place-centered for really creating inside-out change in neighborhoods and cities and communities. So the other thing I just want to just to say is that we also have an opportunity. You want to stick on until we get to before we get to that transition to Q&A. We have an upcoming opportunity to spend more time with Dr. Thurber and learning even more of the details, the ins and outs, become trainers and facilitators in this process. And so our director of community building initiatives will be on to talk a little bit about that opportunity. So stick around until that point in the conversation so you can get those updates. With that, I would love to, well, let me say first, Eric Smith again. I'm the executive director for Community Works, formerly Great Lakes Urban, as some of you may know. And we, of course, are really investing in helping communities and cities and neighborhoods unlock the human and economic potential of their neighborhoods. And so we offer a variety of opportunities and services to help you do that. But a key part of that is just to share best practices and promising practices. And that's where Dr. Thurber comes in. And we really want to dig in deep into that methodology of how do you get, how do you help neighbors collectively understand their story. And so first, to start us off, Dr. Thurber, maybe you'd be willing to say a little bit about yourself as we kick this conversation off.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all today. I'm Amie Thurber. I'm an associate professor of social work at Portland State University. And a little bit just of kind of background, I was raised in Portland, Oregon, lived here for the first 18 years of my life, was very involved in my community here, and then moved to Montana, where I was for the next 18 years of my life. And learned a lot about place in a more rural context, and was involved in community building work, directed a community change organization in Montana, and then did doctoral study in community research and action at Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee. And now I am back on the block I grew up in, five doors down from my mom in Portland. So I really had only lived in three places in my life. And in those places have done kind of been involved in community change kinds of programs and projects and initiatives as a practitioner, and now as a researcher, and do a lot of work about kind of studying how do we make change in communities, both from a policy level, but also a resident driven and kind of grassroots level. So excited to talk about the Neighborhood Story Project as one model for engaging community members and making change in their communities.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let me just note, somebody put on in the chat here that not everybody can see all the chats. We are working to get that resolved so you can see each other's comments. Again, just a huge welcome to everybody that's joined. Allison, Andrew, okay. So we'll be trying to problem solve that piece while Dr. Thurber opens us with saying a little bit about what a neighborhood story, just sharing with us neighborhood story. What does that mean, and what makes the difference in helping neighborhoods identify their neighborhood story?
I was thinking about this question a little bit, and I don't think there is a singular neighborhood story in any neighborhood. There are often dominant stories about a place. There are the assumptions people have about particular areas. There are things that areas are known for, or they have a reputation for. Places that have a reputation for having good schools or bad schools, or the arts district, or the foodie district, or the place you want to avoid being at night. So there are these dominant stories that get told about places, and those dominant stories often mask and bury a whole bunch of other stories about who has been allowed to be in a place or excluded from a place, who has sort of fought to preserve or protect a place, what has been contested over time. So I think that most places really hold multitudes of stories, and some of them we know and some of them we don't know. And so part of my interest isn't really so much in what is the story, but in what ways have those stories been contested? And are there people whose stories have been ignored, suppressed, buried, that that we as community workers can help to mobilize or uplift so that all residents have a voice in shaping their community's future.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And what a good reminder, right? There are multiple stories. That's a great place to start. Maybe you could share a little bit about just orient us to the Neighborhood Story Project, um, and just kind of the details of how that works as a way of lifting up those multiple stories in a neighborhood.
Sure. So, and maybe I can tell a little story by the kind of origin story of the Neighborhood Story Project. When I moved to Nashville for a doctoral study in 2013. And Nashville had just been declared the it city by the New York Times. And there was a ton of development happening there. And of course, a lot of that development is targeted and previously neighborhoods that had high levels of affordability where people can buy low and then sell high. And that phenomenon we some of us refer to as gentrification, when areas that have been had high levels of affordability, suddenly people become priced out and pushed out. And so that was happening really all over Nashville and particularly in historically Black neighborhoods. And so there was a lot of chatter in the city about this. There's chatter from developments about how developers about how exciting this was, that there's this development boom. But there's also chatter from city officials about we're losing all this affordable housing and what do we do? And I also was living in one of those neighborhoods. And one of the things I noticed is that the all the chatter that I was hearing from kind of the development side and the city side was not really aligning with what I was hearing in the neighborhoods, which was people were not just worried about losing the affordable housing or losing their homes. They were also worried about losing their neighbors and losing a sense of connection and a sense of history and losing the historic kind of character of their neighborhoods. There was a whole lot of other stuff they were worried about losing. And so the idea of the Neighborhood Story Project was to create a way for neighbors who are part of communities that are undergoing rapid change to come together and work together to do some project in their community. And so the kind of general model that was the initiative, and it served or the kind of incentive for me to develop something. And the model that developed is basically having a facilitator or facilitators that bring together a small group, like 8 to 12 people who have ties to a particular place, and those people work together for 12 weeks, meeting once a week for a couple hours over 3 months. And in those first few weeks, the goal is just what do we know about our neighborhood and what do we want to know? And so getting clear about, what do we collectively know about our neighborhood's history, and what are the questions that are keeping us up at night about our neighborhood? And by the end of those first few weeks, coming up with a guiding question or a research question that they want to answer together. And then the next chunk of time, the next month or so, is answering that question. And most projects end up that leadership team of 8 to 12 residents might go out and interview their neighbors. They might develop a survey for their neighbors. They might collect archival photos of their neighborhood and contemporary photos. They might go down to city archives and collect data that way. They might look at census data and look at changes of demographics in their neighborhood or housing values. And so depending on their question, they figure out what their data is, they gather their data, and then they, in the last chunk of time together, figure out, okay, now we have all this. What is this telling us? How is this answering the questions we set out to answer? And what do we want to do with what we've learned? And they develop some kind of a community product and a community event to share back and engage with their broader community. And there have now been, I think, 13 or 14 neighborhood story projects across Tennessee and a couple in Oregon. And every single one of them looks really different because they're in different neighborhoods. There were different questions. And so there's not a single path on what these look like, but they're ways to bring neighbors together to answer questions they're concerned about and make some sort of intervention into their neighborhood.
Can you say a little bit more about that? When you say some sort of intervention, like what, yeah, maybe you could share maybe an example or
Yeah.
what does that look like?
Yeah. I mean, again, there's every neighborhood has different things they're concerned about. And I'll say I started this in Nashville where the context that I was paying attention to was gentrification. But now these have happened in lots of other cities that are experiencing other kinds of change. And so I'm a couple examples that come to mind. One is there was a neighborhood story project in Jefferson City, Tennessee, which is Eastern Tennessee, in a historically Black neighborhood that had lost a lot of demographics, had a lot of people move out because they'd lost a bunch of industry and there was not a lot of jobs. And so a lot of families, children had left to go to school and stayed away. And there had been this very strong historically Black school, and that was really the heart of the Black community. And a bunch of folks who had gone to that school wanted to do a neighborhood story project centered on that school. And this group, I think there were about 12 folks in this group, decided they wanted to collect oral histories from their neighborhood. They felt like the history was being lost. And they actually generated a list of 100 people that they hoped to interview in their 12-week project and were very disappointed to only get 38 or something interviews. And I told them, like, I have not met a researcher who could collect 38 oral histories in that amount of time. Like, that was such an amazing achievement. They collected those oral histories. They also collected a bunch of artifacts, and they went to their city library, which did not have any local archival materials at all, much less any Black history, and got the library to agree to archive these oral histories. They had a big community event at the library to kind of announce this collection. And now that material is there and available for generations to engage with. So that particular project was about preserving history and history that was getting lost. There was one of the Nashville projects that I facilitated was much more focused on contemporary issues. This was the Edge Hill neighborhood of Nashville that's kind of tucked between Vanderbilt University, Belmont University, Music Row. For anybody who's familiar with Nashville, an area that it's a historically Black neighborhood that has lost a huge percent of the Black residents over time. Housing values have skyrocketed, and they have uh, still have some public housing in that neighborhood, and that's been, in the process of getting demolished and redeveloped. And there's a lot of fear about people being pushed out. And so that group of residents and the Neighborhood Story Project in Edge Hill really wanted to understand what is happening in our neighborhood right now. How do we get a handle on what's happening right now? How do we try and make sense of it and make it legible to our neighbors? Because it feels really overwhelming and confusing. They brought in somebody, a city expert, to explain how zoning changes work, and which is a very convoluted process involving multiple community meetings. They decided to make a comic book describing that process to kind of make it legible to their neighbors. They also interviewed their neighbors, but instead of turning into an oral history archive, they turned it into more of like an organizing video. So a short video with clips of their neighbors that they could use to kind of activate other neighbors about getting involved in community organizing. And they had a community event called Edge Hill State of Emergency that was really like sounding the alarm about the displacement happening in their neighborhood. And it was really an activating kind of a project. And they had over 100 people come to a community meeting, got huge press coverage, and used that event to launch kind of longer term organizing around tenant rights in their neighborhood. So those are like two very different kinds of projects, but they give you an idea of how sort of the neighbors in each place figure out what is the pressing need, what are we up against, what is the story that we want to uplift here, and what do we want to do with it. Hopefully, it gives you a sense of the directions this can go.
Yes, yes, yes. No, that's fantastic. I appreciate that. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I wonder if you could even take a step back a little bit, like even more broadly. Like, those are the kinds of things the neighborhoods end up doing. What do you see as sort of like the transformation that maybe happens as a result? Like, what's the change that you and in dynamic that you see happening?
Like as a result of a neighborhood story
Yeah,
project.
by going through going through the process. Yeah, process. Yeah.
It's interesting because I, as a I'm a social worker, and I think about change at multiple levels.
Yeah.
And so when I designed this project, I designed it and then researched it. And the change that I was really interested in was what happens to the neighbors who are involved in leading this project. So that group of 8 to 12, what happens for them? And first off, they're more of a captive audience, so it's easier to sort of pay attention to change for that audience. And so I've been studying it now for a bunch of years. There's been lots of story projects facilitated by lots of other people and all over, and I've gotten to interview them and interview the facilitators and talk to people during and after their projects. Um, and what's interesting is that the people who are drawn to participate in a neighborhood story project are people who already generally know something about their neighborhood and care about it. But across the board, the people who participate have increased their knowledge about where they live in ways that are really meaningful to them, and they've deepened their relationships. And they've deepened their relationships with each other, with that group of 8 to 12, but they've also deepened their relationships with other people because almost all these projects involve going out and interviewing other people. And so they've deepened their connections to other people in their neighborhood. And most people um, feel more of a sense of agency at the end of this project. And if there was a kind of a secret kind of agenda to this project, that is it, that people feel a sense of power, both individual and collective power. And, this project is designed on purpose to be short term, to be 12 weeks. That's a commitment most people can like deal with. And that hopefully, if you experience a win in 12 weeks of like, look, we came together, we pulled this off, there's a sense that we could pull off other things. And so for me, that's been really rewarding to see that most people have a sense of feeling like a greater sense of feeling like they can affect change in their community. Not everybody does. Not everybody Well, I say most people feel that way. Not everybody continues to stay involved in a deeper way. One of the surprising findings for me is that the project overwhelmingly attracts older adults, and so across the projects that have happened so far, 70% of the people have been over 55, and most of those have actually been over 65, and so it seems to play a particular role in engaging older adults, probably, in part because they have some more flexibility in their schedule to participate than people who are raising kids or working regular day jobs. But also they have a particular investment and history and knowledge about their communities. And so there's a real particular skill set to bring to bear to a neighborhood story project. And many of them have a lot of energy to stay involved in community change efforts, but not everybody does. So there's some people who are like, that was lovely, and now I'm gonna have my Monday nights back, and they don't want to, keep going. But I've been surprised how many have. So that's sort of that first level of just like the people who were part of the project. And then there's the
Increased
second,
agency and
yeah,
increased attachment to their place, increased connection to each other. Yeah.
yes, connection to place, people, and a commitment to making a difference. And then, there's these other layers of like, well, what about the people who come to those events? And I, in a couple projects, have done some additional research with like the people who've come to the community events to find out like what was that like for you, and there is a sense that both from the research I've done and anecdotally from facilitators and other sites, that those community events are activating in and of themselves. The people who the Jefferson City folks who had that oral history collection that they announced at the library, a ton of people who came to that said, "Well, you didn't interview me. I want to be interviewed. I
Yeah.
have a story
Yeah.
to tell." And they were like, "Okay, we have to do a phase two of this project." Um, and then, there's sort of a third layer of kind of ripple effects, which is what about the broader community? And some of these projects really end up having a larger effect, which is harder to measure over time for sure. It's harder to measure. But I'm thinking about there was a project in Martin, Tennessee, which is Western Tennessee, happened to also be focused around a historically Black school that had been shut down during desegregation, but it was a very important school to members of the Black community. And the school had been shut down and shuttered by the city and sat empty for generation. And the community, as a result of their neighborhood story project, actually went to the city council and said, "We want that building. We want to turn it into a historical museum and community center." And the city sold it to them for $1.
Mm.
And so this story project launched this whole other initiative. So I think, in some ways, these can ripple out into longer standing projects and initiatives.
Yeah. That's excellent. I'm curious about that, right? Because sometimes our communities, our neighborhoods have, um, there is a negative element to our history, right? The school closing down with desegregation, or yeah, neighborhoods I've worked in, history of redlining and all the consequences that come with that. So I don't know yeah. So how do you navigate those elements, right? That could be perceived as negative historical markers. How do you navigate through that?
Well, I mean, I think so much of kind of the heart of any kind of repair or is facing our past, facing harms that have happened. I got to go on a trip this last summer with my mom to research our own family history, and we were um, in Europe and learning a lot about Jewish history and World War II history and Holocaust history. And one of the things we found throughout Berlin and Prague were things called stumbling stones, which you can Google, but they're just small brass markers in the sidewalk um, in front of homes where Jewish people once lived were who died during the Holocaust, and they have their names and the concentration camps that they ended up going to and their dates of their life. And it is I'm not exactly sure why they're called stumbling stones, but you do stumble upon them throughout the city there, and they're small, but they remind you about where you are and what's happened here, and in a way that was very powerful. And of course, one could say it's negative, but it's also just telling the truth about what happened here. And there's something that's also very meaningful to sort of honor the lives. And it's, what I remember with that group in Martin, Tennessee, so many when they talked about that school that was shuttered, several people that I interviewed who were part of that story project told me the same thing, which is this memory they had about the red velvet curtain that hung across their stage. And where did that curtain go? And that it was so evocative to them as a child. It was this beautiful um, part of their school, and it felt very sacred. And they wanted it back, like it had meaning to them. And we can't always know like what are the things that have meaning in a kind of a community or a place. Um, and honoring honoring those places and honoring those losses is really important. And I don't actually, I don't, I think calling them negative is somehow like feels off. It's just like, it's like there are wounds everywhere. We
Mhm.
can't pretend there's not, but we can attend to them in a way that shows care. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate your sensitivity there, right? That's, yeah, uh, showing care, honoring those wounds.
Hmm.
Yeah, well, and kind of the flip side, I just wanted to, if you could share a little bit about, I mean, you've kind of insinuating this, but, you know, in some cases, by reflecting on our story, on our individual stories, our collective story, but sometimes that does propel us to think about and imagine the future, and the future that we want. And do you want to say anything about that as well? Maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you shared the example of taking on the school as a project, right? $1,
Yeah.
the city, and so yeah. Anything else? Any other examples of how you've seen a neighborhood because they're understanding they're who they are now, how that projects
Yeah.
into the future?
I mean, this is the story that came to mind, but it's not quite exactly what you're asking. But I'm thinking of and one of the neighborhood story projects that I facilitated in a different neighborhood in Nashville. It's the Cleveland Park neighborhood in East Nashville, and one of the members of that story project was a guy named Larry. And the first day that I met him was when I went to their community, their neighborhood meeting at their little community center, and I pitched the project and was trying to recruit people who might be interested in being involved. And he wandered out with me after the meeting and he said, "Do you see that light post right there?" It was a light post in the corner of the parking lot. And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I was born under that light post. The house I was born in used to stand right there. And I've lived within 5 blocks of that light post my whole life." I think he was in his early 60s at that time. And so he was a very, I mean, dear, he still is a dear person to me. And he became part of that neighborhood story project team. And he knew a lot about his neighborhood history.
Mhm.
And he learned a lot more while we were doing the research. So one of the things that we studied about, as you know, one of the parts of the neighborhood story project is just to do a timeline of your neighborhood. And I brought in a bunch of books and articles. We did, in a laptop, and people could do some research. And one of the things that we uncovered about the Cleveland Park neighborhood is that that area had been an area where there was a contraband camp in Nashville. So, for people who aren't familiar with contraband camps in the history of the U.S. during the Civil War, the Union Army occupied Nashville, and there were people who were enslaved people from around outside of Nashville who fled and sort of took a chance to come to Nashville to try and claim their freedom. And the Union Army said, "Okay, you can stay here if you help us fortify the city." And
Mhm.
they built what they called contraband camps around the city. Contraband because these people were considered somebody else's property. And those contraband camps became the first Black neighborhoods in Nashville.
Mhm.
And that's where the first Black churches, the first Black schools, the first Black businesses all formed around those camps. And Cleveland Park was where one of those contraband camps were. And had not known that history. And it brought him to tears, sort of claiming that sort of strength and resilience and hope from the people who had set down roots in his neighborhood. And your question was about the future, but it was like something that he drew
Mhm.
from the past that really, I think, helped steel him
Mhm.
for the future that he wanted for his neighborhood. And so I think that, the past and the present and the future are all tied up together. And even for people who know a lot about where they live, there can be so much strength that is drawn from learning more. And
Mhm.
that strength does help us as we live into a future and imagine a future for ourselves and our communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. You've obviously you spent a lot of time really reflecting and thinking, and just I really appreciate what you've been bringing to this conversation. And I know for myself, as I'm walking away from this conversation, I'm thinking, well, what can I do today, tomorrow? And so I don't know if you want to, before we transition to some of the questions that have been coming in, which thank you for that. Make sure you use the Q&A box, get those questions in. Um, but yeah, if we as we transition, I don't know some next steps that you might recommend for us that we could use so we could tap into that rich experience that you've shared with us this morning.
I mean, this is I feel like I have the least to say in some ways about what do we do because you all already know what to do. I think, you get to know your neighbors. You talk to the people in your neighborhood. I think one of the things that I certainly notice is in I live in Portland, Oregon. It's a city where um, we have more and more people who are unhoused and struggling, and we get sort of used to like not asking people if they need a hand because the needs are so high, and we kind of like stop. I've noticed as I navigate my city that people kind of stop looking at each other and stop talking to each other, and you see somebody walking down the sidewalk and you actually cross the street so you don't have to like walk by them. Anyway, I think we've been like unwired
Mm.
from engaging with each other, and we kind of have to figure out, in a way that feels safe to us, how to rewire to engage. And uh, I, so that's really basic, but I think it's still really important to just keep figuring out ways to stay connected to the people in our own communities. I do think learning, spending some time in the archives is really fun and interesting, and learning about our neighborhoods is really fun and interesting. And of course, I think this getting a, if you like this model, you want to lead a neighborhood story project in your own community. I think Megan is going to pop on and tell us how to do that, but I would love to help coach more people in how to start neighborhood story projects in your own communities.
Wonderful. Thank you. And that's a great segue. I am going to, I will let you know, Dr. Thurber, we have some questions. We'll come back with one, Napoleon Bell. Thank you for that question. Napoleon asked, were you able to seek funding for the overall project? So we'll start off with that one, and then we got some others also in the Q&A. But first, I would like to invite Megan. We kind of said she'd be on to share with us about an opportunity to go take a next step and go deeper. So Megan, why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if we haven't met, my name is Megan. I am the Director of Community Building Strategies for Community Works. And I have been, or at least known of Dr. Thurber's work for a long time and have just been waiting for the moment to like actually activate and get this together. So I am so excited to finally be having this conversation. And as Eric said, yes, we are working to bring the Neighborhood Story Project to new communities. So we at Community Works will actually be hosting a facilitator training in Holland, Michigan on June 26th and 27th. You don't have to be in Michigan to participate, but that's where it will be located. And then we'll be supporting some neighborhoods. I think we've got open slots for about 8 neighborhoods to participate in the Neighborhood Story Project. And so I'm going to go ahead. If you're on this call, then you get first dibs to signing up for the interest form. I'm going to drop that in the chat. And you'll see on there, we've got a few questions, and I will also mention the recording of the webinar, anything that I put in the chat, including this form, I'll send out in an email as well. So if you don't get it today, you will still get a copy. But there are places, if you fill it out, if you're interested in your neighborhood participating, there's a spot for that on the form. Maybe you're just someone who's a really skilled facilitator or collaborative discussion coach. And maybe even if your own neighborhood isn't interested, you see maybe there's a fit there. We've got a place for you there, as well as if you're interested but don't think this fall would work for you, still fill out the interest form. So that would be a great next step. You can always reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat with any of the logistics, but we'll be following up with everyone to get a few more neighborhood story projects up and running.
Yeah, and yeah, so Megan, again, just to reaffirm with everybody that yes, this will all the information be coming out also in an email. So pay attention to that. I know we've had some technical difficulties with the chat this morning for some reason, but if you're not seeing those links, it will be coming to you also in your email. So, um, and I just we want to be upfront too that there will probably be depending on how many teams sign up, there will probably be some kind of a cost. We're a nonprofit. We structure ourselves that way because we want to contribute as much as we can, as freely as we can. We had been planning to pursue a grant with the humanities group in Michigan. Most of these humanities groups have lost a lot of their funding because they rely a lot on the federal government. So we will be asking some kind of fee, and but what that is will just depend on how much interest there is. So um, yeah, thank you, Megan, for all your work organizing that. And again, thank you, Dr. Thurber, for opening every calendar to come and help us really get deep into this. So let's spend some time now with some of these questions, starting with Napoleon's question. Yeah, so Dr. Thurber, what do you think? How
Yeah.
are finding funding for these projects?
Yeah. So a couple things. First, I wanted to design something that would be as kind of low budget as possible. And so when I first did the first three projects, I was doing that as part of my dissertation research. So I facilitated them and got volunteer co-facilitators, and we didn't have any costs for ourselves. And then I got small grants from the city arts organization, had a public art organization, and from Humanities Tennessee for the first couple projects. And we had a budget for about $4,000 for each project. And that money was split between or divided between, some little supplies for the meetings, stipends for all of the Neighborhood Story Project team members, and money for the final project, whatever that would be, which is always a little confusing because you don't know what the project's going to be at the start of your project at the start of the 12 weeks. But I just planned on reserving like half the money for the final project and then the rest for stipends and supplies. And we have, it's been wonderful that Humanities Tennessee has adopted this as a statewide initiative and has been giving out mini grants across the state in the years since. So that's how that has continued to be funded. They were unfortunately, one of the organizations that's been impacted by the federal cuts. So that will be challenging for the kind of immediate future. But I think those city arts, like local city government agencies and arts-based agencies and humanities agencies might be in other places to look for funding.
Great, great, great. I do want to note before I go to the next question, but Heather Conkins from Grand Rapids is saying, "Oh my gosh, I love this." So just want to reaffirm that this has been a very rich conversation. We want to appreciate that. Um, let's take this question from Janine Ward, and Janine's I consider her a dear friend. We have a common love for Africa. So from Janine from South Africa asks, "Have you had any experience using this process with youth? And if not, could you suggest how or if this might work?"
Yeah, there have been a couple projects that were more youth focused. So one I led was in a focused. It was one of the three Nashville projects focused around a particular school zone that was really a kind of contested school. And that project was about half high school students and half people who were connected to the school in other ways, alumni, parents, former teachers. And then there's also was a project in the last couple of years that was all young people. That one was in Morristown, Tennessee, and focused in the Latino community. There's been a huge growth in the Latino community in that city, and it was a youth-driven project. And there's not really anything different. I mean, it's the same exact curriculum. I think one of the main tweak with working with young people is that in the neighborhood story project model, when people are going out and collecting data, interviewing their neighborhoods, et cetera, a lot of that when you're working with adults can happen between meetings, that neighbors would kind of get their interview guide, their questionnaire, and then go out on their own and interview their neighbors. And for young people, because they don't have their own wheels a lot of the time, they don't have their own transportation, and also their schedule is set by the adults in their lives. We have found in those projects it makes sense to like build in the data collection during the time we're together, so that in the weekly blocks we're using, if it's like time to do interviews, we are going out and doing interviews together. So there's been very small tweaks, but otherwise the curriculum seems to have worked really well for all ages. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just kind of going in on that, because talking about the questions and those kinds of details. Jay asks, are there particular questions that you have used that turned out to be life-giving questions for research or for connecting with neighbors?
Such a lovely question. And I do use a lot of questions to kind of spark reflection, and especially in the beginning weeks of the project. One of the activities that I have used, and for anybody who comes to the facilitator training, there'll be a whole facilitator guide that actually it has the curriculum, but it has all handouts and kind of scripts for the weekly meetings. It has a lot of detailed information, with the expectation that you can modify it heavily. But I want to give people more than enough. But one of the activities is really a set of questions that it is a handout with sentence starters, and that people can finish the sentences. So it's things, I'm totally making this up because I don't have the handout in front of me, but things like, what I love best about my neighborhood is the things that I worry about my neighborhood are, the things I want to protect in my neighborhood are, the things I wouldn't mind losing in my neighborhood are, things like that, just to get people starting to think about what their hopes are, what their fears are, what their dreams are for the place they live. And those prompts are not like fancy, but it's amazing how evocative they end up being. And it's the way that people finish it that really opens up conversation and reflection. And it helps people identify where there are similarities in the groups in terms of like shared interests, concerns, hopes, but it also surfaces where there are differences. And that's important in these groups too. Not everybody agrees about what the neighborhood should be, and that's okay. And so it's those kinds of tools that allow us to kind of surface both the things we have in common and the ways we see things differently.
Yeah. Yeah, love it. And I was just in Fort Wayne, Indiana, this past weekend. They have their Fortify neighborhood accelerated ways. I just loved it. They started their process with postcards. Not that kids don't postcards these days, but back then it worked, right? So they had kids drawing, about the question of this will be a great neighborhood when, and they were just drawing what things they saw. So it's all the different ways to get at this participatory sort of action research.
Definitely.
And then let's see, let's go to Priscilla. Thank you, Priscilla, for joining us. Priscilla asks, what would be the commitment from the facilitators, both in terms of financial commitment, time, investment. So we'll start with that.
Yeah. Well, the facilitator work involves kind of the pre-work is figuring out the neighborhood you want to do this project, building relationships in that neighborhood, kind of get vetting the neighborhood to see is this something that people here are interested in. I really recommend having a local neighborhood organization that's like a partner in the project, whether it's a church or a school or a community center, that can help, maybe physically host the sessions, but also have some help you do kind of get buy-in and interest. Um, I recommend having facilitation teams, a pair of people. We have had that I mean, I had it in the projects I've led and everywhere else that's happened as well. And the facilitators do the recruitment of the participants. They prepare the meetings, they lead the meetings, any kind of follow-up in between meetings. The kind of time, the meetings themselves are 2 hours over, 12 weeks or so. And there is some between meeting, prep work. I kind of think of the facilitator as the staffer of the project. So if your team is going to do interviews in your weekly meeting, you will brainstorm those interview questions, but then it might be the facilitator who like types them up and sends them out. And when I was working with some of my elders who, don't have computers and printers, I was dropping off stacks of interview guides at their house and showing them, teaching them how to use their phone to audio record interviews and things like that. So you're kind of functioning as a staffer sometimes, for your project. So it's the amount of time will vary a little bit week to week, but there's more than, probably another 3 or 4 hours outside the meetings. Yeah. And I will say a lot of the organizations historically that have participated in as like the facilitators that come out of organizations that had a commitment to doing community work. So this was sort of part of their work and could see it as part of their work time, whether it's a community development organization or even we've had some librarians who folded it into their community outreach work to facilitate this. Librarians have been great facilitators. They know a lot about the archival resources in their community, and other kinds of community workers also.
Wonderful. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention here, Priscilla also was asking about that timeline question. I think you worked this around a 12-week sort of timeline, but can you say more about the time,
Yeah. So it's the project itself, I think of it as like 14 weeks. So 12, the last two are a little bit, there's some flex there, but 12 weekly meetings. And then you have a community event. So technically that community event could be the day after your last meeting. So it doesn't have to be a week later, but a community event and then a final debrief session with your team. So it should be able to have that be done within 14 weeks. It might be a little bit less. There's the pre-work of, recruitment, getting your neighborhood, vetting the neighborhood, all of that probably takes a few months. So I think thinking of this in terms of, it's a 3-month project, but maybe you start working on it a few months before that.
Wonderful, excellent. Well, we're coming close on time, so I think I apologize if I didn't get to all of your questions, and we can try to do maybe facilitate some additional information in our follow-up email around those. But I do want to thank everyone once again for being here. In a minute, Dr. Thurber, I'll ask what I ask most people at the end as to what's giving you hope these days. But I want to thank everybody for coming. Part of what gives me hope is seeing everybody on here. I just want to say again, shout out to Jim. Thanks for saying hi. Appreciate you being here from Virginia. And Dr. Moki, thank you for joining us from Uganda. I'll be in touch for sure. I saw your question. Thank you. John, Allison, everyone. Just thank you again so much for being here. So, Dr. Thurber, maybe you can wrap us up with what's giving you hope.
You didn't warn me about that one. Um, I'm at work today, and my students definitely give me hope. I have, getting to hang out with students who are committed to making their communities better and are tooling themselves up to be able to be change agents I feel very fortunate that that's my day job. Um, and also, sunshine helps, flowers help, dogs help, glimpses of babies help.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Very good. Wonderful. Thank you. I'll just, Janet, thank you for your comment there. Janet says, thanks for the great information and specific tips. So really appreciate that. Heather again says, thank you so much. And I'll just echo that. Dr. Thurber, what an enriching conversation. Your process, your methodology, but also just the spirit you bring to this has been impactful to me, and I know to many others. And I just want to thank you again. Janine says 2025 is my storytelling year. Um, so thank you, Janine, for being on here. I don't even know what time zone you are, so this is amazing. Working on a few ideas. My hope is that I'll be able to add this to this year's activities. Thank you, Eric. Connected the sure. Wonderful. 7 p.m. Oh boy. Okay, well, again, everyone, just thank you so much. Pay attention to the email. We apologize again for the technical issues. We love the chat function because we want this to be a space of community. We need that. And that's where we draw a lot of our hope from. That's part of the point of the process. So, Dr. Thurber, everyone, once again, a huge thank you. And pay attention to the email and pay attention. We're going to have really a great speaker at our next quarterly conversation. So wonderful. And Jay says, can't wait till you come to Holland.
I'm excited. Thanks you guys so much. It's been lovely to spend this time with you.
Yeah, wonderful. And Jeffrey, we'll share those chats. You asked about that. We'll share that out. With that, everyone, have a wonderful day, a wonderful rest of the week, and we'll catch up with you next time.